was fatherless, a stranger with no hope. Your kindness awakened me from my sleep. Your love, it beckons deeply, a call to come and die. By grace now I will come and take this life, take your life. Sin has lost its power, death has lost its sting. From the grave you've risen victoriously. Into marvelous light I'm running, out of darkness, out of shame. Through the cross you are the truth, you are the life, you are the way. Into marvelous light I'm running, out of darkness, out of shame. Through the cross you are the truth, you are the life, you are the way. Yeah. My dead heart now is beating, my deepest stains now clean. Your breath fills up my lungs, now I'm free, yeah. Sin has lost its power, death has lost its sting. From the grave you've risen victoriously. Into marvelous light I'm running, out of darkness, out of shame. By the cross you are the truth, you are the life, you are the way. Into marvelous light I'm running, out of darkness, out of shame. By the cross you are the truth, you are the life, you are the way. Yeah. Lift my hands and spin around, see the light that I have found. Oh, the marvelous light is Christ in you. Lift my hands and spin around, see the light that I have found. Oh, the marvelous light, marvelous light. Oh, into marvelous light I'm running, out of darkness, out of shame. By the cross you are the truth, you are the life, you are the way. Into marvelous light I'm running, out of darkness, out of shame. By the cross you are the truth, you are the light, you are the way. Yeah. Oh.
Hey family, welcome back this Wednesday as we continue our study into Esther. Tonight we're going to be in Esther chapter 8. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. Just a reminder of Esther and how it is a story of God's providence. It is a story of God working throughout the life of Esther. Honestly, it is a story of God working in the Persian king Ahasuerus. Some people call him Xerxes. It's the story of God working in his life without him even knowing it. It's the story of God working in the life of Haman without Haman even knowing it. It's the story of God working in Esther's cousin Mordecai. It is a story of God's providence and God's working and God fulfilling his plan throughout their lives, whether they know it or not. The key, I think, to the book is found in Esther chapter 4, when Haman, this wicked guy, is trying to annihilate the Jews, and Esther has been made queen through some maybe not the greatest circumstances, but she is there and she is queen. And Mordecai goes to her and he says, Esther, how do you not know that God has not brought you here for such a time as this? He's not put you where you are to help save your people. How do you know that God hadn't brought you? How do you know this isn't the whole purpose for what's happening? And so she accepts that challenge and she begins to move forward, and God really begins to move forward at the end of chapter 4 in this story, and you see him working and working and working and moving and moving and moving. And so last week we saw in Esther chapter 7, Haman, this guy who was just trying to destroy the Jews, we find him reach a bad fate. He is hung on a gallows that he had built to hang Mordecai on. He is recognized in this evil plot. Esther calls him out before King Ahasuerus. And so now when we come to chapter 8, you're ready to celebrate. You're ready. Hey, the story is over. Mordecai and Esther won. Haman is dead. Yay! Whoo! It's done. But it's not. The story isn't over. And what we're going to see in this text today is that God was continuing to work. Now, there was reason to celebrate. They had reason to celebrate. They had reason to stop and go, God, thank you so much. But the work wasn't over. God was continuing to work. And Esther and Mordecai, how did they not know that God had not brought them here just for the destruction of Haman? That wasn't it. He had brought them there to save the Jews. And so their work was still to carry on. For us, I think we need to celebrate victories. We need to celebrate times where we see God move, and we need to celebrate times where God has blessed us. But we need to understand and we need to recognize that God doesn't stop. As I was studying for this passage, I thought of that song Waymaker in the bridge, where I won't sing it for you, but the bridge says, you never stop working. You never stop working. And God, He never stops. And as believers, I think a message for us is that we need to recognize that God never stops. He never stops working, and we need to continue to obey. We need to continue to follow. And if He's not going to stop, then we don't. And so for us, the challenge is then to keep working and honestly love it. Whistle while we work, like the Seven Dwarfs would say, and keep letting God use us, keep letting God move through us, because He's going to. God's going to move and God's going to work. And the challenge for us is then to join in that work, to join in Him working, and not have Him work in spite of us, but have Him work through us. And so we want to keep doing that. So the question then comes is in this story, in chapter 8 of Esther, how does God continue to work? I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I want to. We're going to study the whole chapter, but I'm not going to read it all at one time. It's 16 verses, so we're just going to look at a few verses at a time. The first, what I want us to see is that Esther and Mordecai, they do celebrate God's blessings. Look here in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 8, and here's what it says. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Haman's plot was revealed. Esther came to the king and said, here's what Haman's trying to do. The king was furious. The king had Haman hung on the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. And so he said, at that point, he gave all of Haman's valuables, everything that he had, he gave it to Esther. Mordecai is called in because not only has Esther told the king that she was a Jew, but she also told him how she was related to Mordecai. So Mordecai is brought in, and the king gives Mordecai the very ring that Haman had that made Haman second in the kingdom. We've talked about that. That very ring, the king gave that to Mordecai. And so now Mordecai has been elevated, and Esther has set Mordecai over all of the property, over all the stuff of Haman. Mordecai has been put in charge of, and so it's time to celebrate victory. And they do that. They do stop for just a minute and say, okay, look, whoo, we won. Mordecai, your life is saved. Yes, Esther, your life is saved. Whoo, the guy who's trying to annihilate the Jews, he's been done away with. Yes, victory, victory, victory. But that's not the end of the story. Now, they do celebrate, and they do recognize the blessing that God has given them. And we need to do that. When God blesses us, when God does great stuff in our life, when God moves, when we see God move, we need to stop, and we need to, as the old saying goes, we need to stop and smell those roses, and we need to stop and look around and go, whew, God has done some amazing things in my life, and we need to stop, and we need to look back on when we were saved, and we need to look back at when we were baptized, and we need to look back at those crucial moments in our lives that God has moved and God has worked, and we need to recognize God's movement in our lives at those times. And that's a good thing to do, but that's not the end of the story. God doesn't stop working until everything has been brought into completion. And while we've reached a high point in our life, the work is not over. It wasn't for Esther and Mordecai. Look, here's what happens next. They count the blessings. They celebrate the blessing that God has given them, but they go on and continue the work. First of all, they continue this work with passion. Look at what he says in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 8. Here's what Esther does. Verse 3. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept, and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. So here's what happens. They celebrate what God has done, but then Esther immediately goes. She falls at the king's feet. She weeps. She pleads. She begs. She is passionate about what God is doing, how God is working, and how she is part of that, and what God is not only doing in her life, but what God is doing in the life of her people. And so she comes before the king making a very passionate plea, weeping at his feet, because God is continuing to work, and what he has called her to do is continuing on. So it's not like, okay, yeah, we've won this victory, but oh yeah, by the way, king, one more small favor, please, if it's not too much trouble. No, that's not what she does. Passionately, she begs and she pleads for the life of her people. So with passion, she continues the work. She also continues the work with wisdom. Look at what she does in verses 5 through 8 and the wisdom of Esther. In verse 4, the king held out the scepter to her. She rose and stood before the king. And then here's what she said to the king. If it please the king, if I have found favor in his sight, if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So in wisdom, she comes before the king, building him up. King, please, if it pleases you, King, if I find favor in your eyes, if you delight to look at me, if being as wise and generous as you are, King, please please consider my people. Also notice that she never calls this a law. She calls it an order. She calls it an edict, because laws of the Persian king cannot be revoked. He even goes on and says, he says that, he says in that last verse, in verse 8, he says, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. So here's the problem. While Haman is dead, the edict that was written, that he wrote and sealed with the king's ring, it can't be revoked. So now Esther and Mordecai, they have to find some other way to save the Jews. They have to do something else. And so what she is begging and pleading the king with passion, and I think with wisdom, in the way that she goes about talking to Ahasuerus. Because remember, very selfish dude. He's built himself way up in his own head. So if it please you, king, if I find favor in your eyes, king, and all these things, she says with wisdom, to allow the king to let them work, let her and Mordecai find another way for the Jews to be saved, and the king gives in. So we see the wisdom of Esther in this story, and God continued to use her and the wisdom that he's given her. But next we're going to see the wisdom of Mordecai in this story, and how God is continuing to use him. In verses 9 through verse 14, here's what Mordecai does. Listen to what he says. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded. Not Esther, what Mordecai commanded. So we're seeing the wisdom of Mordecai here concerning the Jews. To the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces. To each province in its own script, to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force or any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the capital. So here's what happened. Mordecai, even though they can't stop the edict that said the Jews were going to be annihilated, they were going to be put to death in the 12th month. Even though they couldn't stop that on the month of Adar, they couldn't stop that. Here's what Mordecai did in the wisdom that I think God provided them, and we see God's providence working here. In that wisdom, what Mordecai did was he made an edict that allowed the Jews, on the day that they were supposed to be annihilated, it allowed them to assemble, to gather together, to take up arms against anybody that comes against them. And if anybody comes against them, not only can they destroy the people that come against them, they can plunder what they had. Here's what I don't know that the Jews were totally looked down upon throughout the whole kingdom. We're going to see in Susa they really weren't. I don't know that I'm sure that in places they were, and I'm sure there were people who wanted to destroy the Jews just because that's how it's been throughout history. But I don't know that everybody was. And when this edict came out that said, hey, look, not everybody, when this edict came out that said the Jews could defend themselves, people just kind of went, I'm not so sure about this. I'm not so sure that I want to go to attack, because not only can they come after me, but then they can go and take my stuff. They can plunder my stuff, the goods that my family has. And so what's going to wind up happening is nothing. I mean, the Jews are not going to be annihilated. People are not really going to come out against them in force. Some are. We're going to see in chapter 9 that some people are going to come after the Jews, but it's not going to be the way Haman wanted it to happen, because now the Jews can defend themselves. Not only can they defend themselves, but they can plunder the goods of those people who come after them. So Mordecai has all the scribes come in. They write this down in every language throughout the province. They send this out to all the provinces. Not just slowly though. Listen, they send it out quickly, swiftly on horses that have been used for royal purposes. And so it's recognized now. It's the 3rd month. This is not going to happen to the 12th month. So you have about 9 months here to get this word out, but they don't do it slowly. Still, swiftly, they send it. I think part of the reason that this happens is because the Jews for 3 months already have been worried, what's going to happen to us? We are going to be annihilated. But now, I think Mordecai doesn't want them to be worried anymore. Now, hey, not only now you don't have to worry because you can defend yourself, and it also gives them 9 months to prepare to defend themselves. 9 months to get weapons together and get groups together and get plans together and all these things that need to happen. So swiftly it is sent out to all the provinces. And so now we see God moving, continuing to move. We see Him continuing to move in the life of Esther, with passion that she goes before the king, with wisdom that she goes before the king. We see God moving in the life of Mordecai, giving him wisdom on an edict to send out to the people to help save the Jews. And then finally, I think what we see in this chapter is we see them count on God and depend upon God. Listen to what happens in verse 15. And here's what happens as they depend on God. Listen to what happens. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown, and with a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. And the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now listen, only God can do this. Mordecai, who was supposed to be hanged, now he has been brought before the king. He's been given the king's signet ring. He leaves the king's presence in royal robes of blue and a crown set upon his head. He has been elevated in the kingdom. Now, don't get me wrong. Just because we depend on God doesn't mean that great things like this are going to happen. But here's what I want you to see. What happens to the Jews in verse 16. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. As we depend upon God, as we count on God to move and to work, as we trust Him, as we obey Him, as Mordecai and Esther are doing, as we follow Him, as we do what He's called us to do, as we recognize that maybe God has brought me here for such a time as this, and we fulfill the purposes that God has for us, as we do those things, we may not find a crown here on this earth like Mordecai did, but I believe we will find light and joy and gladness and honor. I think we will find those things as we count on God. So here's the message for us. Celebrate when God does great things in your lives, but no, He's not finished. He's not finished until the day of completion, when it has all been made right. Until that happens, God is moving and God is working. And He will continue to move and work. And just because He's used you before, and just because you've allowed Him and you've obeyed Him, and He hasn't had to work in spite of you before, and you've reached a high point, it doesn't mean it's time to stop and throw up our hands and say, whoo, I wish I could go back to those days when God used me. You can. Maybe not the way He has before, but God is continuing to work, and He is continuing to move, and He wants to continue to move inside of me and inside of you. And he wants to carry out His purposes, not in spite of us, but through us. So with passion, with wisdom, we need to seek God. We need to follow Him. We need to depend upon Him. And as we do that, no matter what's going on around us, I mean, the danger is not totally over for the Jews. There's still a chance that people are going to come after them and try to kill them. But there is light because they can defend themselves. There is joy and there is gladness and there is honor because God is moving and God is working and they are depending upon Him. And in our lives, I'm not saying everything is going to be perfect, but I am saying this. When we depend upon God and His moving and His working, when we trust Him fully, as Esther and Mordecai have done, when we obey Him, what we're going to find is light and gladness and joy and honor. I pray that in these times, as I've said every week, we will depend upon God and we will be light to this world around us. We will be peace in the midst of corona chaos. We'll show people peace. We will point people to a God who is not scared, who is not surprised, who is not fearful. We will not show fear, but we will show dependence and obedience to God who is in control. And in the midst of that, we find light and gladness and joy and honor. Let me pray for you. God, you are good and we love you. We thank you for today. We thank you for how you're moving. God, in the midst of chaos, we thank you that you are moving. And God, we pray that we will obey you and you will not have to work in spite of us, but you will work through us as you have done in the lives of Esther and Mordecai. We love you so much. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, one quick announcement. Sorry about this past Sunday. If you tried to get on to my Sunday school class on Sunday morning, I was having technical difficulties at home. I had to run up here to the church, and by the time I got on, it was just kind of late. Working to resolve that. So this Sunday, we're back on for Sunday school at 11:30. A text will be sent out right after the service that we have at 10:30. Right after that service, a text will be sent out where you can log on to Zoom and be a part of that Sunday school class. If you would like to do that, you can join us, and I will do my very best to make sure that does not happen again, and I'm on there right at 11:30 when we talk about. Thanks. Have a great week.